In the sweltering summer of 1990, the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, seemed to shimmer under the oppressive heat. But for 14-year-old David Anderson, the real pressure came from within the walls of his family's modest two-story home on Elm Street. The air inside was thick with tension, a stark contrast to the carefree laughter of children playing in sprinklers just beyond their neatly trimmed lawn. David stood in the living room, his lanky frame taut with defiance, blue eyes blazing with a mix of anger and fear as he faced his father, Richard Anderson. Richard, a man whose very presence seemed to fill the room, towered over his son. His weathered hands, calloused from years of manual labor, were clenched at his sides, knuckles white with barely contained fury. "I've had enough of your attitude, boy," Richard's voice boomed, each word landing like a physical blow. "You think you can just do whatever you want? Skip school, talk back, stay out all hours?" David's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wanted to back down, to apologize, but something inside him refused to yield. "You don't understand anything about me," he shouted back, his adolescent voice cracking with emotion. "You never even try." From the kitchen doorway, Sarah Anderson watched the confrontation unfold, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She wrung her hands in her apron, wanting to intervene, but knowing from experience that it would only make things worse. 10-year-old Emily peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Understand? I understand that you're throwing away every opportunity we've given you. I understand that you're becoming a good-for-nothing delinquent." The words cut deep, and David felt something snap inside him. "Maybe I wouldn't be if you weren't such a dictator. You can't control everything I do." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Richard's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Is that so? Well, if you think you're man enough to make your own decisions, you can do it somewhere else. Get out." David's bravado faltered for a moment. What? "You heard me. Get out of my house. If you're so grown up, go make it on your own. I'm done trying to raise an ungrateful brat." Sarah gasped, stepping forward. "Richard, no." But Richard held up a hand, silencing her. "He's made his choice, Sarah. He wants to be a man? Let him be a man." David stood frozen, his mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. But as he looked into his father's eyes, he saw no hint of bluff or hesitation, only cold, hard resolve. With shaking hands, David grabbed his backpack from the floor. He started towards the stairs, intending to pack some clothes, but Richard's voice stopped him. "No, you leave with what you've got on you. Nothing more." Tears threatened to spill from David's eyes, but he blinked them back furiously. He wouldn't give his father the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Without a word, he stormed past his mother and sister, ignoring their pleas, and yanked open the front door. The summer heat hit him like a wall as he stepped outside. He could hear Emily calling his name, her voice small and frightened, but he didn't look back. Pride and anger propelled him forward, down the porch steps and onto the sidewalk. As David walked away from the only home he'd ever known, the weight of his situation began to settle on his young shoulders. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that seemed to mock the darkness growing in his heart. Where would he go? What would he do? The first tendrils of fear started to creep in, but David pushed them aside. He'd show them. He'd show them all. One day he'd come back, and they'd regret ever throwing him away. With each step, his resolve hardened, turning his fear into determination, his pain into fuel. Little did young David know that this moment, this single act of parental cruelty born from frustration and misunderstanding, would set in motion a chain of events that would not only reshape his life, but ripple out to touch countless others. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, David Anderson stepped into a world that would test every fiber of his being, forging him in the fires of adversity into a man none of them could have imagined. The first few nights after leaving home were a blur of confusion and fear for David. He found temporary refuge in the basement of his best friend Jake, sneaking in and out when Jake's parents weren't around. But he knew this couldn't last. The constant fear of discovery, coupled with the shame of his situation, gnawed at him relentlessly. On the fourth night, as he lay on the cold basement floor, staring up at the ceiling, David made a decision. He couldn't stay in Millbrook. Every familiar street, every friendly face now seemed to mock him, reminding him of what he'd lost. No, he needed a fresh start, somewhere he could reinvent himself. With nothing but the clothes on his back and the meager savings he'd scraped together from odd jobs, David set out for Cleveland. The city loomed in his imagination as a place of opportunity, a concrete jungle where he could lose himself and perhaps find a new purpose. The journey to Cleveland was David's first real taste of the harsh realities of the world. He hitchhiked, catching rides with truckers and families who looked at the scruffy teenager with a mix of pity and suspicion. Each mile that passed put more distance between him and his old life, but it also stripped away another layer of his innocence. Cleveland, when he finally arrived, was overwhelming. The towering buildings, the endless streams of traffic, the sheer mass of humanity moving in all directions, it was a far cry from the quiet streets of Millbrook. For the first time since leaving home, David felt truly alone. Those initial weeks in the city were a brutal education in survival. David quickly learned that the streets of Cleveland were unforgiving to those unprepared for their challenges. He slept in parks, huddled in doorways, always alert, always watching. The other homeless individuals he encountered were a mixed bag. Some offered advice or shared what little they had, while others saw him as easy prey. One particularly cold night, as David curled up on a park bench, his stomach aching with hunger, he seriously considered giving up. The thought of swallowing his pride and returning home flitted through his mind. But then he remembered his father's words, the look of disappointment and disgust on his face. No, he couldn't go back. He had to prove them wrong. It was during this low point that David met Mr. Jenkins. The old man found David rummaging through a dumpster behind a restaurant, desperate for anything edible. Instead of chasing him away, Mr. Jenkins offered him a job washing dishes inside. Mr. Jenkins, a grizzled veteran with kind eyes that had seen too much, took David under his wing. He wasn't one for overt displays of affection, but in his gruff way, he became the mentor David so desperately needed. "Life's gonna knock you down, kid," Mr. Jenkins told him one night as they closed up the restaurant. "The trick is to get back up one more time than it knocks you down." Those words became a mantra for David, a lifeline he clung to in his darkest moments. And there were many dark moments. The work was grueling, the pay meager, but it was a start. David threw himself into every task, no matter how menial. He scrubbed pots until his hands were raw, mopped floors until his back ached, all the while observing, learning, planning. Mr. Jenkins, recognizing the fire in the young man's eyes, began to teach David about more than just washing dishes. He showed him the basics of running a business, the importance of saving and investing, no matter how small the amount. "Money makes money," he'd say, "but only if you're smart about it." David soaked up every lesson, every bit of advice. By day, he worked at the restaurant. By night, he educated himself, reading every book he could get his hands on from the public library. Business, finance, self-improvement, nothing was off limits. He was determined to arm himself with knowledge, to never again be at the mercy of others. As months turned into years, David's situation slowly improved. He moved from sleeping in shelters to renting a tiny, run-down apartment. It wasn't much, but it was his, paid for with honest work and careful saving. Each small victory, each step forward, reinforced his belief that he could make it on his own. But success came at a price. The soft-spoken, emotional boy from Millbrook was fading away, replaced by a harder, more cynical young man. David built walls around his heart, determined never to be vulnerable again. He channeled all his pain, all his longing for the family he'd left behind, into an iron will to succeed. On his 18th birthday, David stood on the roof of his apartment building, looking out over the Cleveland skyline. 4 years had passed since he'd walked out of his childhood home. 4 years of struggle, learning, and gradual progress. He thought about his family. Did they ever wonder what had happened to him? Did they care? The ache of their absence was still there, a dull throb in his chest, but he pushed it aside. "I'm going to make it," he whispered to the uncaring city below. I'm going to be someone, and one day they'll all wish they hadn't thrown me away. As the sun set on his childhood, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, David made a vow to himself. He would build an empire, create a legacy that would force the world, and his family, to recognize his worth. With newfound determination, he turned away from the view and headed back to his tiny apartment. There was work to be done, a future to build, and David Anderson was just getting started. Little did he know that the road ahead would be filled with challenges and triumphs beyond his wildest imagination, and that the true measure of his success would come not from the wealth he would amass, but from the heart he thought he'd left behind in Millbrook. As David entered his 20s, the lessons he'd learned on the streets of Cleveland began to bear fruit. His landscaping business, started with nothing more than borrowed tools and sheer determination, was growing steadily. What had begun as a one-man operation mowing lawns and trimming hedges was evolving into something more substantial. David's days were long and grueling. He'd wake before dawn, load up his second-hand truck with equipment, and work tirelessly under the hot sun. But unlike the back-breaking labor of his early days in Cleveland, this work filled him with a sense of purpose. Each perfectly manicured lawn, each satisfied customer, was a step towards the future he envisioned for himself. It wasn't just physical labor that occupied David's time. Every evening, after the day's work was done, he'd pore over books on business management, marketing, and finance. He attended free workshops at the local community college, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. The boy who had once rebelled against authority now hungered for every scrap of information that could help him get ahead. As his client list grew, so did David's ambitions. He began to see beyond just cutting grass and planting flowers. He observed the neighborhoods he worked in, noting the real estate trends, the types of properties that seemed to appreciate in value. An idea began to form in his mind, a vision of a future that went beyond landscaping. It was around this time that David made his first real estate investment. It was a small, dilapidated house in a neglected neighborhood. Most people would have seen a money pit, but David saw potential. Using the skills he'd honed in his landscaping business and calling in favors from contacts he'd made over the years, David set about renovating the property himself. The process was arduous. David worked on the house every spare moment he had, often by the light of cheap battery-powered lamps late into the night. There were setbacks, unexpected repairs, permit issues, moments of doubt when the task seemed insurmountable. But with each problem solved, each improvement made, David's confidence grew. Finally, after months of hard work, the transformation was complete. The rundown eyesore had become a charming starter home. When David sold the property for a tidy profit, he felt a rush unlike anything he'd experienced before. This, he realized, was what he wanted to do. From that point on, David's focus shifted. Landscaping became a means to an end, providing the capital he needed for his real estate ventures. He began to buy more properties, each one a little larger, a little more ambitious than the last. He developed a knack for seeing the hidden value in neglected buildings, for understanding the ebb and flow of neighborhood dynamics. As his successes mounted, David's reputation began to grow. People in the Cleveland real estate scene started to take notice of the young man with the uncanny ability to turn troubled properties into gold. Investors began to approach him, offering partnerships and opportunities. But David was cautious. The lessons of his past had taught him to be wary of relying too much on others. He chose his associations carefully, always maintaining control of his ventures. The scared, lonely boy who had arrived in Cleveland years ago was gone, replaced by a shrewd, sometimes ruthless businessman. By the time David turned 25, his landscaping business had expanded into a full-fledged property development company. He had a small but dedicated team working for him, people who shared his vision and work ethic. David was no longer just flipping houses. He was buying up entire blocks, transforming neglected areas into desirable neighborhoods. His success brought wealth, and with it, a change in lifestyle. David moved out of his modest apartment into a sleek downtown condo. He traded his old truck for a luxury car. He began to dress in tailored suits, to dine in expensive restaurants. To the outside world, he was the picture of a successful young entrepreneur living the American dream. But beneath the polished exterior, David was still driven by the pain and anger of his past. Each new achievement, each million added to his net worth, felt like a vindication. In quiet moments, he would imagine his father's face, picturing the shock and regret he was sure would be there if Richard could see him now. Yet for all his success, there was a hollowness to David's life. His relentless pursuit of wealth and status left little room for personal relationships. The walls he'd built around his heart kept out not just pain, but joy as well. He dated casually, but never allowed himself to form deep connections. His employees respected and admired him, but none could truly call him a friend. As his 30th birthday approached, David found himself at a crossroads. He had achieved more than he'd ever dreamed possible when he'd first set foot in Cleveland. He was wealthy, respected, powerful. But something was missing, a void that no amount of money or success seemed able to fill. It was during this period of introspection that David made a decision that would once again alter the course of his life. He decided to leave Cleveland, the city that had both broken and remade him. He set his sights on Los Angeles, a city of dreams and reinvention. The move to LA was more than just a change of scenery. It was a chance for David to redefine himself once again. He arrived in the City of Angels with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just going to be successful, he was going to make a difference. In Los Angeles, David launched his most ambitious project yet, a property development company focused on building affordable housing. He had seen firsthand the struggles of those living on the margins, and he was determined to use his skills and resources to make a positive impact. The project was not without its challenges. David faced skepticism from investors who couldn't understand why he'd want to focus on low-income housing when luxury developments promised higher returns. He battled bureaucracy and zoning laws, often finding himself at odds with local officials and established developers. But David was in his element. Every obstacle only fueled his determination. He used his charm and business acumen to win over skeptics, his knowledge of construction and development to overcome technical challenges. Slowly but surely, his vision began to take shape. As the first of his affordable housing communities neared completion, David felt a sense of pride, unlike anything he'd experienced before. This wasn't just about making money or proving his worth. For the first time, he was creating something that would genuinely improve people's lives. The opening of the first community was a turning point for David. As he watched families move into homes they could actually afford, as he saw children playing in safe, well-designed spaces, something shifted inside him. The cold, calculating businessman began to thaw, revealing glimpses of the compassionate boy he'd once been. This newfound sense of purpose began to permeate other areas of David's life. He started to engage more with the communities he was building, not just as a developer, but as a member. He attended local events, listened to residents' concerns, and worked tirelessly to address them. For the first time in years, David began to feel a sense of belonging. His reputation in Los Angeles grew, but not just as a savvy businessman. David became known for his philanthropy, his commitment to ethical development, and his genuine desire to improve the lives of others. He donated generously to local shelters and youth programs, remembering all too well his own struggles as a homeless teenager. Despite his outward success and the positive impact he was making, there remained a persistent ache in David's heart. As he approached his 40th birthday, the weight of his estrangement from his family began to press on him more heavily. The anger and resentment that had fueled him for so long were fading, replaced by a gnawing sense of longing and regret. In quiet moments, David found himself wondering about the family he'd left behind. What had become of them? Did they ever think of him? The image of his little sister Emily, confused and tearful on that fateful day, haunted him. She would be an adult now, with a life of her own. Had she followed her dreams? Was she happy? These thoughts began to consume David, distracting him from his work and disrupting his sleep. He realized that for all his material success, for all the good he was doing in the world, he couldn't truly move forward until he confronted his past. With a mixture of trepidation and hope, David made a decision that would once again alter the course of his life. He hired a private investigator to locate his family. As he waited for news, David was a bundle of nerves. Part of him feared what he might learn. Had his parents passed away? Had Emily forgotten him entirely? Another part of him, the part that still carried the hurt of that 14-year-old boy, worried that they simply wouldn't care. When the report finally arrived, David's hands shook as he opened it. His parents were still alive, though his father's health was failing. They were struggling financially, trying to keep afloat the small family business that had once been a source of pride. And Emily, his heart clenched at the thought of his baby sister, had become a schoolteacher, dedicating her life to helping children much like the troubled boy he'd once been. The information was like a key unlocking a door David had kept firmly shut for decades. Emotions he'd long suppressed came flooding back: anger, hurt, longing, and a surprising surge of protectiveness towards the family he'd thought had discarded him. For days, David grappled with what to do next. The businessman in him wanted to swoop in, solve their financial problems with a wave of his checkbook, and leave. The hurt child wanted to stay away, to let them struggle as he had struggled. But the man he'd become, the man who had learned the value of compassion and community, knew there was only one right path forward. With a heart full of trepidation and a glimmer of hope, David decided to return to Ohio. He would face his past, confront the demons that had driven him for so long, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to heal the wounds that had shaped him. As he boarded his private jet, leaving behind the gleaming towers of Los Angeles for the modest landscapes of his childhood, David felt as if he were stepping into the unknown. He was no longer the angry, defiant teenager who had stormed out of his family home, nor was he quite the cold, driven businessman he'd become. He was someone new, someone forged in the fires of adversity, but tempered by compassion and a desire for redemption. The flight to Ohio gave David time to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the streets of Cleveland to the boardrooms of Los Angeles, he had traveled so far, yet in many ways, he was coming full circle. As the plane began its descent, David gazed out the window at the familiar patchwork of fields and small towns below. Somewhere down there was the key to the last locked door in his heart. With a deep breath, David steeled himself for what lay ahead. He didn't know if reconciliation was possible, if the chasm of years and hurt could be bridged. But he knew he had to try. For the first time in decades, David allowed himself to hope. Hope for understanding, for forgiveness, and just maybe, for the chance to be part of a family again. As the wheels touched down on Ohio soil, David Anderson, the self-made millionaire, felt the stirring of something he thought he'd lost long ago, the vulnerable, yearning heart of a boy who just wanted to come home. The rental car seemed to shrink around David as he drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook. Each landmark brought a flood of memories: the park where he'd played as a child, the school he'd attended, the corner store where he'd bought candy with his allowance. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, unchanged by the years that had reshaped David so dramatically. As he turned onto Elm Street, David's heart began to race. The modest two-story house came into view, looking smaller and more weathered than he remembered. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, the paint on the porch peeling. It was a visible testament to the struggles his family had faced in his absence. David parked across the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a long moment he sat there, gathering his courage. What would he say? How would they react? The questions that had plagued him for weeks now screamed for answers. Finally, with a deep breath, David stepped out of the car. The summer heat hit him, reminiscent of that day so long ago when he'd walked away. But this time, instead of anger and defiance propelling him forward, it was hope and fear that guided his steps. He was halfway up the walkway when the front door opened. Sarah Anderson stood there, a dish towel in her hands, her eyes widening in disbelief as she took in the sight of the man before her. She was older, of course, her hair streaked with gray, lines etched around her eyes and mouth. But in that moment, as recognition dawned, she was both the mother he remembered and a stranger. David? Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile with shock and a lifetime of unspoken emotions. David felt his carefully prepared words evaporate. "Mom," he managed, his own voice thick with feeling. For a heartbeat, they stood frozen, years of separation stretching between them like an impassable chasm. Then, with a choked sob, Sarah rushed forward, enveloping David in an embrace that spoke volumes. The scent of her, a mix of laundry detergent and the faint trace of the perfume she'd always worn, hit David like a physical force, unlocking memories he'd thought long buried. "Oh, my boy," Sarah wept, her tears soaking into David's expensive shirt. "My boy, you've come home." David found himself clinging to his mother, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. All the years of hurt and anger seemed to melt away in the warmth of her embrace. For a moment, he wasn't a successful businessman or a self-made millionaire. He was simply a son reunited with his mother. Their emotional reunion was interrupted by a gruff voice from inside the house. "Sarah? Who's at the door?" David tensed, recognizing his father's voice despite the years that had passed. Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes and taking David's hand in hers. "Come," she said softly. "It's time." As they stepped into the house, David's senses were assaulted by the familiar sights and smells of his childhood home, the worn carpet beneath his feet, the ticking of the old grandfather clock, the faint aroma of his mother's cooking. It was all achingly familiar, yet somehow foreign. Richard Anderson sat in a wheelchair in the living room, a blanket draped over his legs. The years had not been kind to him. The strong, imposing figure of David's youth was gone, replaced by a frail man with thinning hair and sunken cheeks. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had once flashed with anger, were as sharp as ever. Those eyes now widened in shock as they landed on David. "It can't be," Richard murmured, his voice a shadow of its former strength. David stood tall, meeting his father's gaze. "Hello, Dad," he said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah hovered anxiously between her husband and son, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to bridge the gulf between them. Richard's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been regret. "You," he began, then faltered. "You're alive." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Of course David was alive, but he'd been dead to this house, to this family, for so long. "I am," David replied simply. He didn't know what else to say. How does one summarize decades of life, of struggle and triumph, in a few words? The silence stretched, uncomfortable and laden with the weight of years of separation. It was Sarah who finally broke it, her voice trembling but determined. "I'll make some tea," she said, squeezing David's hand before hurrying to the kitchen. Left alone with his father, David felt like that 14-year-old boy again, unsure and on edge. But he was no longer that boy. He was a man who had faced the world and won. Drawing on that strength, he took a step forward. I heard you've been unwell," David said, gesturing to the wheelchair. Richard's jaw tightened, pride warring with vulnerability on his weathered face. "Just old age," he muttered. "Nothing to be done about it." Another silence fell. This one filled with the ghosts of conversations never had, of apologies never made. David's eyes roamed the room, noting the signs of financial strain, the threadbare curtains, the outdated television, the general air of making do. "The business," David began hesitantly. "Mom said it's been struggling." Richard's eyes flashed, a glimpse of his old fire. "We get by," he said gruffly. "No need for charity." The words stung, but David pressed on. "It's not charity, Dad. It's family." Family. The word hung between them, a bridge and a barrier all at once. Richard's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something, regret, longing, passing over his face. Before either could speak again, the front door burst open, and a whirlwind of energy swept into the room. "Mom, Dad, I got your message. What's the The voice cut off abruptly. David turned to find himself face to face with a young woman, her eyes, so like his own, wide with shock. Emily, his baby sister, now a grown woman, stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still on the knob. "David," she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and dawning joy. Is it really you? And suddenly David was engulfed in another embrace, this one fierce and almost desperate. Emily clung to him, her body shaking with sobs. You came back, she kept saying over and over. You really came back. David held his sister tightly, his own emotions finally spilling over. I'm sorry, he murmured into her hair. I'm so sorry I left you. As they stood there, reunited at last, David felt something shift inside him. The last pieces of his carefully constructed armor began to crumble. Here, in the arms of the sister he'd left behind, in the presence of the parents he'd both longed for and resented, David Anderson finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. The road to healing would be long and fraught with challenges. There were years of hurt to overcome, misunderstandings to clear, and bridges to rebuild. But as David looked around at his family, his mother returning with a tray of tea, his father watching with a complex mix of emotions, and Emily still holding on to him as if afraid he might disappear, he knew that this was where he belonged. The prodigal son had returned, not in defeat, but in triumph. And in that triumph, he had found something far more valuable than all the wealth he'd accumulated, the chance to reclaim the love and connection he'd thought lost forever. As the family gathered around, awkwardly at first but with growing warmth, David realized that his journey had come full circle. He had left this house as a boy, angry and alone. He returned as a man, successful beyond his wildest dreams, yet humbled by the realization that true wealth lay not in his bank accounts, but in the hearts of those around him. The road ahead would not be easy. There were wounds to heal, trusts to rebuild, and a lifetime of missed moments to reconcile. But as David sat in his childhood home, surrounded by the family he'd thought lost to him, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This, he realized, was his true success story. Not the buildings he'd erected or the fortunes he'd amassed, but the family he'd found the courage to reclaim. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a warm glow, David Anderson knew that he had finally, truly, come home. The days that followed David's return to Millbrook were a whirlwind of emotions, revelations, and tentative steps towards reconciliation. The initial shock of his reappearance gave way to a complex dance of reconnection as each member of the Anderson family navigated the unfamiliar terrain of their new reality. For David, it was a journey of rediscovery. The town he'd left behind as an angry teenager now revealed itself through the eyes of the man he'd become. He walked the streets of Millbrook, reacquainting himself with old haunts and discovering how much had changed and how much had remained the same. But it was within the walls of his childhood home that the real work of healing began. Each day brought new challenges, as years of pent-up emotions, misunderstandings, and unspoken truths came to the surface. Sarah, her initial joy at David's return, tempered by the weight of years of worry and regret, found herself caught between her husband and her long-lost son. She fluttered about the house, trying to bridge the gap between them, her love a palpable force seeking to mend what had been broken. I never stopped looking for you, she confessed to David one quiet afternoon as they sat on the porch. Every year on your birthday, I'd light a candle and pray that wherever you were safe. The revelation hit David hard. He'd spent so many years convinced that his family had forgotten him, had moved on without a second thought. To know that his mother had carried him in her heart all this time was both a balm and a fresh wound. I'm sorry, he said, taking her hand. I should have reached out, let you know I was okay. Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. You're here now, she said softly. That's what matters. With Emily, the connection was easier, albeit tinged with the bittersweetness of lost time. She was eager to know everything about David's life, his struggles, his triumphs, the man he'd become. They spent long hours talking, bridging the gap of years with stories and shared laughter. I used to imagine what you were doing, Emily confessed one evening, as they looked through old family photo albums. On my first day of high school, I kept thinking how you should have been there to see me off. When I graduated, I looked for you in the crowd. David's heart clenched at the thought of all the milestones he'd missed. Tell me everything, he said. I want to know about your life, your dreams. And so Emily shared her journey, her decision to become a teacher, inspired in part by the memory of her troubled brother, her hopes of making a difference in the lives of children who might be struggling as David had. It was Richard, however, who presented the greatest challenge. The initial frostiness between father and son thawed slowly, like winter giving way to a tentative spring. Their conversations were stilted at first, fraught with unspoken accusations and long-buried hurts. But as the days passed, something began to shift. David, seeing his father's frailty, found the anger that had fueled him for so long beginning to ebb. Richard, confronted with the successful, compassionate man his son had become, struggled with a complex mix of pride and regret. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a quiet moment when David was helping Richard with his physical therapy exercises. As David supported his father's weight, guiding him through the motions, Richard suddenly spoke, his voice gruff with emotion. "I was wrong," he said, the words seeming to cost him great effort. "That day, I was wrong to send you away." David felt his breath catch in his throat. He'd imagined this moment countless times over the years, but now that it was here, he found himself at a loss for words. Richard continued, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. "I was scared I was losing you, scared I couldn't control you. But instead of trying to understand, I pushed you away. It's been my greatest regret." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and monumental. David felt the last vestiges of his long-held anger begin to crumble. "I was no saint," David replied softly. "I was angry, rebellious. I didn't make it easy for you." Richard's eyes met his son's, a lifetime of unspoken emotions passing between them. "We both made mistakes," he said. "But you've become a man I'm proud to call my son." The words washed over David like a healing balm. For so long he'd sought his father's approval, even as he'd told himself it no longer mattered. To hear it now, after all these years, was more powerful than he could have imagined. From that moment, the dynamic between David and his family began to shift. The walls of resentment and misunderstanding that had stood for so long began to crumble, replaced by bridges of newfound understanding and forgiveness. As the weeks passed, David found himself becoming more involved in the family business. He brought his years of experience and business acumen to bear, working alongside his father to breathe new life into the struggling enterprise. It wasn't always easy. Old habits and differences of opinion led to heated discussions at times, but there was a new respect underlying their interactions, a willingness to listen and compromise that hadn't existed before. Emily, inspired by David's philanthropic work in Los Angeles, began to dream bigger. She shared her ideas for community outreach programs, for ways to help underprivileged students in Millbrook. David listened with growing excitement, seeing in his sister's passion a reflection of his own desire to make a difference. Together, they began to formulate plans for a foundation that would combine David's resources with Emily's on-the-ground knowledge of the community's needs. It was a project that energized them both, a way to channel their shared experiences into something positive. Sarah watched the transformation of her family with joy and a touch of wonder. The home that had for so long been shadowed by the pain of David's absence now rang with laughter, heated debates, and the warm buzz of shared dreams. As summer gave way to fall, David found himself facing a decision. His life in Los Angeles called to him, his business commitments, his philanthropic projects, the life he'd built for himself. Yet the thought of leaving Millbrook, of once again being separated from his family, filled him with a sense of loss. It was Emily who provided the solution. "Why does it have to be one or the other?" she asked during a family dinner. "You've built something amazing in LA, but you're needed here too. Why not do both?" The idea took root, growing into a plan that would allow David to split his time between Los Angeles and Millbrook. He would continue to oversee his West Coast operations, but also invest time and resources into revitalizing his hometown. For the first time in decades, David felt truly whole. He had reconnected with his past without being bound by it, had found a way to integrate the man he'd become with the family he'd left behind. As he stood on the porch of his childhood home, watching the autumn leaves dance in the breeze, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a scared, angry teenager to a successful but lonely businessman, to a man who had found his way back to what truly mattered. It had been a long and often painful road, but as he heard the sounds of his family inside, his mother's gentle laughter, his father's gruff chuckle, Emily's animated voice, David knew that every step had been worth it. He had built an empire of brick and mortar, but here, in this modest house on Elm Street, he had found his true legacy. The story of David Anderson was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, new mountains to climb, and undoubtedly moments of doubt and difficulty. But he would face them not as a solitary figure, driven by the ghosts of his past, but as a man surrounded by love, supported by family, and guided by a deeper understanding of what truly constituted success. As the sun set on Millbrook, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, David smiled. He had left this town as a boy, angry and alone, seeking to prove his worth to the world. He returned as a man, successful beyond his wildest dreams, only to discover that true wealth lay not in his bank accounts, but in the hearts of those around him. David Anderson had come home, not just to a place, but to himself. And in that homecoming, he had found the greatest success of all, the ability to bridge the past and the future, to heal old wounds, and to build a legacy of love that would far outlast any empire of steel and glass. As he turned to go back inside, to rejoin the warmth of his family, David knew that his greatest adventures still lay ahead. But now, he would face them not alone, but surrounded by the love and support he had once thought lost forever. The prodigal son had not just returned, he had found his true place in the world. And so, as night fell on Millbrook, the Anderson house glowed with a warmth that reached far beyond its walls. Inside, a family once broken was whole again, their laughter and love a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of family.